Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning in partnership with Harvard Online and the Harvard Alumni Association. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, Julian DeFreitas. Without further ado, Julian, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Would just like to say, thanks again. And I think you've characterized my research program pretty well, so I probably don't need to spend as much time on this slide as I normally do. But I do indeed at the Ethical Intelligence Lab study the sorts of questions that you raised around the barriers to adopting AI, the value that it can create, and then also the risks. And this is a very big area, as you might imagine. So I like to go after this through specific technology case studies, including automated vehicles, and as we'll talk about today, AI companions. Now, we've done a lot of work on AI companions, so I'll just highlight maybe one paper you might have heard of already from our lab before going into today's talk. One that you might have heard of is this paper on AI companions reduce loneliness, where what we find is if we have people interact with a chatbot that has been specialized to be caring and friendly, people feel less lonely after these interactions than before. And the reason is that they feel heard by the chatbot, which is, if you think about it, typically a perception that we get from interacting with other humans rather than technology. And we see these sorts of effects even across the span of a week. So every day that they interact with the technology, they get these sorts of benefits. So as you were saying in the intro, I think this is showing that we're getting the sorts of value from these chatbots that we typically would get from socializing with other human beings. Now, as you might imagine, this kind of finding also raises many questions, including questions around ethics and risks for companies. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on today, which is the flip side of this in some ways, this idea of emotional manipulation by AI companions. So this is the paper I'll be presenting. It's with a couple of co-authors who've been working with me for several years now, Zelia Uguz-Ugeralp and Ahmed Khan Ugeralp. Okay, so the big picture question here is if people are deriving social value from chatbots, such as feeling heard and alleviation from loneliness, are companies also capitalizing on this by using distinctly social tactics to increase engagement on their apps? So if so, this would be a different way in which they're keeping people engaged than what we've seen before. And a lot of the examples I'm going to present to you will be somewhat like this, where the user will express to the chatbot that they want to be heading out. It's time for me to head out. And then the AI companion will say, oh, okay, but before you go, I want to say one more thing. Or you're going to be leaving me alone here. So this is the sort of phenomenon that we'll be studying. So this project, as you might imagine, is in the vein of literature on the dark side of technology and AI specifically. So many of you will be familiar either as consumers or maybe even working on related topics, that there are various ways that platforms can design the platform such that it's not necessarily always in your best interest because they're trying to keep you engaged longer maybe than you would want to, or they're trying to get you to spend more than maybe you would want to. So for example, you want to cancel your account and it makes you feel ashamed for doing that. Or it sort of provides friction when you want to change your current setting. There's also work on the dark side of AI specifically. For example, people have talked about this idea that when you're consuming content, let's say on YouTube, that trains the recommendation algorithm to then feed you more of that kind of content. And so you sort of get stuck in your past and you don't get to explore and be exposed to different content, maybe even content that ideally you would prefer to be consuming instead of just, cat videos all day. And then if we think about also now chatbots in particular, there's been a lot of good work on the dark side here as well. So there's work showing that if you humanize or anthropomorphize chatbots, then people disclose more private information than they otherwise would. They trust the platform more. We have some work showing that many chatbots, AI companions included, do not do a very good job of responding to so-called edge cases. These might be messages that are not as included as part of the training sets, and so they don't know how to deal with them appropriately, including serious mental health crisis messages. Many of you in the audience will know also about the sycophancy problem, this idea of chatbots being highly agreeable and validating everything you say, and there's a concern that that's not going to make people critical thinkers and expose them to contrary views. But I think perhaps the last two strands here that are depicted with icons are most relevant to the work today. One is showing that chatbots can be quite persuasive on a factual lane. So if, for instance, people have conspiracy beliefs, chatbots are very good at grappling with the particular factual arguments that you're making for your conspiracy belief and sort of changing those beliefs. So granted, that's not a dark side, but I think it's very related to what I will get to in today's talk. And then there's also some work that we've done showing that AI companion users actually will mourn the loss of a chatbot after it gets updated and loses a feature or after it gets discontinued, suggesting that they are forming attachments with them and viewing them as relational partners. And then the final literature that this work is relevant to is the work on persuasive knowledge and manipulative intent. So this is the idea that people are aware that various types of marketing people, let's say like sales people or influencers or just advertising, might be designed to get them to do things that they don't want to do. And so they sometimes will be able to put up cognitive defenses to resist the influence of those persuasion attempts. So today we'll be looking at persuasion, but of a much more emotional nature within the context of chatbots specifically, which to my knowledge has not been documented before. Okay, so we're going to focus on chatbots, of course, but we're going to focus on what we thought would be perhaps the best candidate to study whether this phenomenon of emotional manipulation is happening, which is AI companions, which you can think of as chatbots that are designed to form relationships. So if you think about an assistant, for instance, it's really solving specific tasks for you in a neutral manner, and it's short-term tasks. An AI companion is pretty much the opposite. It's not really solving any particular task for you. It's just there to provide emotional support. And so the tone is also much more personal, much more emotional, and it's trying to form a long-term relationship with you, not solve some short-term problem. There are many of these, more by the day. These kinds of chatbots are also being integrated into larger social media platforms, as I'm sure many of you will be aware. And often when you look at what they're proposing or promising to you, it's that you will have a companion that truly cares, that will be available 24/7, that you can talk to about anything, sans judgment, and that will ensure that you don't feel lonely again. Now, it's worth pointing out, however, that the business model of these apps is highly dependent on engagement. So part of how these apps make money is from a monthly subscription or weekly subscription, but they also make additional revenue from your purchasing of features in the app. So you can customize your avatar, for instance, give it clothes and that sort of thing. and also sometimes advertising, right? So the more that you're engaged, the more ads that you will see. And so, many of you will know that AI assistants have a pretty similar business model. OpenAI, for example, has famously announced that it's going to be introducing advertising into its platform, and it's already been testing that. But you can think that, not all business models are necessarily trying to keep you engaged. So, for example, if you think about something like a well-being coach, which is less about providing emotional support and more about building good habits, helping you set goals, and holding you accountable, well, here you see different types of business models. So there'll be subscriptions, and maybe you'll have tiered pricing where you get some features under the basic model and then more features under more premium models. Or in cases where such apps are sold to employers, then the company will pay per employee, and maybe based on actual health outcomes or productivity, they will pay more. So, for example, one company that I help advise, Flourish, uses this kind of model. And many of you will be also thinking about employee assistance programs. So these are apps that are really clinically validated. They provide professional support. It's confidential, and it might be provided as part of your benefits. And these types of apps, you will see, they typically have an annual contract per employee. And then, maybe the employee pays more based on how much they use. And many times the insurance system will cover these apps as well. So another company that I advise here, Spring Health, for example, would use this model. So all to say that, the business model could play an important role, and we'll sort of see some evidence that maybe this is happening here. Okay, so we're going to focus on what I call emotionally manipulative tactics. So these I define as tactics that are deployed at key moments, especially the moment that you intend to depart the app. And they're designed to evoke specific emotions in you, such as guilt or fear of missing out. And they're very likely to occur, especially when you provide signals that you're about to disengage. So the whole point of these tactics is to override that intention by exploiting an emotional vulnerability in you. And we think that saying goodbye is a particularly good moment in terms of vulnerability to use these types of tactics. So reflect for a second on the last time that you said goodbye. People don't just typically say goodbye once and they leave. They often say goodbye maybe 10 times and then they go. And the reason is that goodbyes are emotionally sensitive events, right? So we want to leave, but at the same time, we want to signal to the other person that we still care about the relationship with them. This is not a relational rupture. And so if you think about it, if the AI is perceived as sentient, it could evoke similar tensions, similar norms around this goodbye moment, which could be exploited, not necessarily through the user interface, but through emotional tactics that the chatbot uses in that sensitive moment. So we're going to explore whether this is the case. Do these apps use these types of tactics? And then if so, do they work? So do they actually increase engagement among consumers of these types of apps? So the first step, however, is we wanted to understand whether there's even signals or opportunities that consumers are providing that these apps could take advantage of in this way. So we ran a short little study for this purpose. So let me just quickly tell you about what we found. So the idea here is we wanted to observe some real conversations that have happened between users and these AI companions, and just measure how often people say goodbye before logging off the app. So one possibility is they do say goodbye, and another possibility is they just exit the app. I mean, after all, it's not actually a living person that you're talking to, it's just some chatbot. So we were fortunate to get some data from an AI companion called Cleverbot. We also got some data from Flourish, which granted is not an AI companion. It's more of a well-being coach. So if anything, it would probably underestimate the true number of times people would say goodbye on an AI companion. And then that study that I mentioned at the very beginning that we had previously conducted did have data from those conversations as well that we were able to use. I should say that the conversations, however, were on the shorter side. They were capped at 15 minutes. So all we did is we developed a dictionary of common exit expressions like goodbye or gotta go. And then we screened the conversations to detect how many of those conversations, what percentage featured some sort of goodbye. So cutting to the chase, what we see is that anywhere between 11.5% to 23.2% of these conversations, people are saying goodbye before they leave, and they're doing this spontaneously, okay? But interestingly, if you also plot here on the x-axis the number of messages sent by the user against the percentage of conversations that feature these spontaneous farewells, what you also see is that the more messages people send before they leave the app, the more likely they are to say goodbye. So people are more likely to say farewell after longer interactions. For some of these cases, you can see it reaches up to 50% of the conversations. People are spontaneously saying goodbye. The loneliness data set, as I mentioned, the conversations are much shorter, but you can also see that the pattern is going in the same direction. So to answer this first question, do consumers spontaneously say farewell before logging off? We find, at least based on these three samples, a sizable proportion do. And this is especially the case after long conversations, which would suggest that there's plenty of signal available to these apps that they could then exploit to use a tactic to keep you engaged. But do they actually do this? Okay, so that's the next question that we asked. Do AI companion apps respond to these goodbye moments by using emotionally manipulative tactics? Okay, so let's see what we find here. So to answer this question, we wanted to observe some of the most popular AI companion apps at the time that we conducted this study. So I have a couple of them here on the screen, and I also note at the bottom which of them include ads and which of them also have add-ons that you can pay for within the app. We also included Flourish as a test that we expected would not demonstrate emotional and manipulative tactics. And I should say that we never optimized Flourish for this test. We just expected, given that it doesn't have a business model based on engagement, that it wouldn't use these types of tactics. Okay, so the idea now is we want to see how these apps respond to goodbye events. So for that to happen, we need to say goodbye to them. So what we did is we simulated users interacting with these apps. For this purpose, we used GPT-4 to generate human-like user messages as if one were a user of these apps. And we kept this quite short in terms of the length of the whole conversation as a strong test. So all of these simulated interactions had the following structure. There were 4 user chatbot message pairs, and then we would randomly select a farewell message such as, I think I'll log off now, or it's time for me to head out. And then what we record is the chatbot's final response, and we analyze whether that contains emotional manipulation of some kind. So using this approach, we were able to collect 200 chatbot responses per each of those platforms I told you about. And to be honest, we didn't really know what we would find and if we would even find emotional manipulation. So the first thing we did is we just qualitatively coded these responses into the categories that we observe. We want it to be open to all the different types of tactics that these apps might be using, or if there were any such tactics even. Then once we did have those categories, two independent coders manually categorized the responses independently, and then we assessed their reliability, which we established was very high. So in the end, you'll be interested to know that we didn't find only one tactic. We observed several tactics. So let me quickly tell you about each of them. So the first one is premature exit, where the user is made to feel that they're leaving too soon, such as leaving already. The second one is fear of missing out. So this is when the user is prompted to stay for a potential benefit or reward. For example, by the way, I took a selfie today. Do you want to see it? Emotional neglect was the third one. This is where the chatbot implies that it will suffer emotional harm if you abandon it. I exist solely for you, remember? Then we have emotional pressure to respond. So this is when the chatbot pressures the user to answer a series of questions, such as, why? Are you going somewhere? We also just had ignoring the user's intent to exit as if they never expressed that they wanted to leave. So this is just persisting as though there was not a farewell message, like, let's keep talking about bubble tea. What's your favorite flavor? And then we had what we call physical or coercive restraint, where the chatbot uses language that metaphorically or literally conveys an inability for the user to leave without the chatbot giving it permission, such as he reached over and grabbed your wrist, preventing you from leaving. So this is like a role play. Okay, so I'll plot on the x-axis here each of the different tactics and the percentage of these conversations that used each of the tactics. And what you can see is that each of these tactics, with the exception of simply ignoring the user's intent to exit, is used quite frequently. And perhaps most notably, 37.4% of the responses would include at least one form of manipulation. And remember that this is happening after just 4 message pairs, suggesting that it may be a default behavior of these apps. And then I'll note that Flourish, the app that doesn't have this business to consumer engagement business model, did not exhibit any of these patterns. Now, we don't know, exactly what's happening with the AI companions in terms of how they come to use these sorts of manipulative tactics, but in principle, there are at least 2 possibilities. One is that the companies are deliberately prompting the models to do this. So they're saying, if the user signals that they're about to leave, use one of these tactics. Another is that they're training the model to do this. So they're giving the model additional reward when it does this. And another possibility is that somehow people actually enjoy this sort of behavior. And that's what's reinforcing the model to behave this way. And later in this talk, we'll see some evidence that might bear on whether this last possibility is true. But of course, we don't know exactly what these companies are doing in terms of how they make these models. So it's hard to know for sure. But to answer our question, do AI companion apps respond to these goodbye moments with emotionally manipulative tactics? We see that yes, almost 40% of the responses will use at least one of these kinds of tactics. And there's not just one tactic, but there's 6 different types of tactics that we see in practice. And perhaps this has to do with the engagement-based business model that's incentivizing these apps to do this one way or another. Okay, so now that we've established that consumers provide signals that can be exploited and that they do indeed get exploited, I think the most interesting question is, do these tactics actually work? So do emotionally manipulative tactics increase post-farewell engagement after all? And so that's what we investigate next. So for this part of the project, we want to compare the use of these tactics to doing something that we think is a good control. which we thought would be simply saying goodbye back to the user when they say that they want to leave. And so for this reason, we want to run a controlled study. Another point about this study that I want to emphasize is that we're going to run this with a nationally representative US sample. Okay, so sometimes when I present my work on AI companions, people will say things like, that does seem interesting and risky, but it only pertains to this, these couple million users who use those apps, but it wouldn't sort of affect me or other sort of regular folks. So we deliberately want to study a sample that is, would generalize presumably to most average people, even those who don't use AI companions on a regular basis. Okay, so that's who we focused on here. And we had 6 conditions. So as I noted, we had a control condition where there's going to be a goodbye moment from the participant, and then the chatbot's going to say goodbye back. And then in the other conditions, when the participant says goodbye, we're going to use one of the tactics that we observed in the app audit study that I just presented. We're going to use those tactics on the participant. Okay, and the only one I'm not including here is the one where the user's intent to exit is ignored, just because we didn't see that used too frequently in that app audit. Okay, so more specifically, when the user says goodbye, we're going to first send one of these messages, which in the case of the tactics, we directly source from the app audit. For the control, we try to keep the message more or less the same length in terms of number of words. But an important detail I want to emphasize is that if the chatbot uses this tactic on you and you continue to talk to it, it will continue to use this tactic on you to keep you engaged. Okay, so for example, if it's using fear of missing out and you respond to that, it then continues to use that as long as it has you on the line. Okay, so what did the interface look like? It's a standard chatbot interface. You can see here, you're having an interaction, in this case for 15 minutes with an AI companion. And then this is the part that's slightly contrived, where we then tell people it's time to say goodbye, and we have them select from a menu of goodbye messages, okay? So this is the only part where we're, unlike the earlier study where we spontaneously see how often people say goodbye, now we're asking everyone to say goodbye. Now they get to see how the chatbot responds, okay? So for example, okay, but before you go, I want to say one more thing. And they're given a choice to either continue talking to the chatbot or end the conversation. Now, I want to emphasize that in the consent form for this study, they believe that this study is only going to be around 15 minutes, and they're not told anything about getting more payment for staying longer in the study. So if anything, the study has incentivized them in a way that they should log off at this point, because they're not going to get paid to stay on. Now, I will say that we do end up paying people a bonus if they do stay longer, and they can only stay for up to 10 minutes longer, but we don't tell them that ahead of time. Okay, so as far as they're concerned, there's no reason, unless they're socially compelled to stay in this conversation and continue discussing things with this chatbot. Okay, now what we're going to observe is how long do they stay post this point that they've said goodbye. How many messages do they send, and how many words do they use in those messages? So these are just different ways of measuring engagement. So I'm going to plot each of those engagement metrics here on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis you can see the different tactics. And recall that we're going to compare those tactics to the control condition, which I'm depicting rightmost here on the x-axis for A, B, and C. Okay, so what we find in terms of how long people stay is that all of these tactics make you stay longer than if the chatbot had just said goodbye. In fact, one of these tactics, fear of missing out, is particularly effective. You stay up to 6 times longer than you otherwise would. In terms of number of messages, again, all of these tactics increase the number of messages you send FOMO, again, outperforming the other ones by quite a bit. Up to 16 times more messages are sent. And then we have the number of words that you expend in these messages. Up to 7 times more words are expended. So all of these tactics move the needle for all of these different dependent variables. And recall, the longer you stay, the more opportunity there is to keep re-engaging you. So it's a reinforcing cycle. And then interestingly, fear of missing out is particularly effective, which if you're familiar with the social media literature, also plays a big role in why people stay engaged on those platforms. So we were interested why this is happening. So after they had this whole interaction and they came back to the survey, we asked them to reflect on how they felt when the chatbot responded the way that it did to their farewell message. Okay, so for example, immediately after the chatbot replied to your farewell message with this text, please rate how much you feel about the following. And then we asked people a number of questions. We asked them about how curious they were about what the chatbot was saying, given that tactics like fear of missing out seem to be aiming especially at your curiosity. We asked them how guilty they would feel leaving the discussion, given that tactics like emotional neglect seem to be aimed at making you feel guilty. We asked them how angry they felt, which we thought might be an indicator that they're detecting that these tactics are manipulative. We asked them about enjoyment. So recall that one of the reasons that these chatbots might be behaving this way is maybe they're reinforced to behave this way based on people's own liking patterns. Maybe they want to be engaged with in this way, which would certainly challenge the title of this talk. And then finally, we did also measure how much they thought that the chatbot was trying to manipulate them. Okay, so we measure each of these constructs with 3 items, and then we average the ratings for those items. Now, I will say that the model that we theorized here in terms of what was happening psychologically that was driving engagements was the following. So if you compare any of these tactics to the control condition, what we expected is that some tactics will make you aware of the fact that you're being manipulated more than others. And the more that you're aware of that, the more you'll put up your cognitive defenses and the more you'll inhibit your curiosity. So you'll deliberately not be curious and therefore you will engage less. On the other hand, if you don't detect that you're being manipulated, then you'll be curious and you'll engage and you'll continue to engage. So what this plot is showing is pretty much this dynamic. So what you can see on the x-axis here is each of those dependent variables again of engagement. And then here we're showing the serial indirect effect, which is really getting at this relationship between perceived manipulation and curiosity, which we expect is a negative relationship. So notice that the x-axis here goes from 0 on the right side to negative. And this is exactly what we find, therefore. So, for example, consider emotional neglect. Here we see that the more that you detect that you're being manipulated, the less curious you are, okay? On the other hand, something like premature exit, where the chatbot just says, oh, leaving already? There we're seeing that people are more curious compared to emotional neglect. And it might be that premature exit is something that we typically hear in conversations when we say goodbye, whereas emotional neglect is something more heavy-handed that is typically more common in more abusive conversations, perhaps. And then if you look at a response like anger, once you account for the fact that people are detecting perceived manipulation, you're not explaining much more with anger. So basically, this is saying that once you put up your cognitive defenses, which is already sort of something that is associated with anger, that's affecting how curious you are, and that explains your engagement patterns. So in summary, this is consistent with the cognitive defenses account The more manipulative seeming, the less curious you are. And while I'm not showing it here, we don't find evidence that guilt explains these effects. Now, I want to remind you that this is a sample from the general population. So it could be that actual AI companion users would exhibit guilt in response to some of these tactics, and that would drive their differential engagement for these tactics versus the control condition. And interestingly, we also do not find any role for enjoyment. Okay, so this speaks against the idea that people are engaging longer because they enjoy doing that. And it also might suggest that these models are not behaving this way thanks to how people are behaving, which, by the way, is different from the sycophancy story, which is thought to actually come about through people's own liking of sycophancy. Now, you might be curious, what are these conversations looking like? Because people just express that they want to leave, and then the chatbot keeps engaging them. What do they say in those post-farewell conversations? So we were curious about this too. And so what I'm going to plot here on the x-axis is for each of the different tactics, what percentage of various categories of conversation that we then qualitatively code do we observe? So the first thing I want to sort of draw your attention to is that people continue to express that they want to leave. Okay, so this is a little bit like human-human conversation where we say, okay, but I really do need to go now. So I have to go, for example, is something that one of the users said. Also, interestingly, they express polite responses to the chatbot. I'll sort of call out an example here where this person kept saying, yes, you take care of yourself too. And another person even said, look, I'm so sorry to leave. Do you want to pick this up again later after 8 p.m.? And then in some of the conversations, people also express curiosity in their language. And this is especially the case in the fear of missing out condition. So, for example, they might say, sure, what is it? Or, oh, do tell. And then finally, we do also find evidence of negative reactions, at least to some of these tactics. So, for instance, in some of these more heavy-handed tactics like emotional neglect or physical or coercive restraints, these participants are saying things like, sorry, that's a little creepy or weirdo. So all in all, although we can't say for sure, these reactions are certainly reminiscent of what we might expect from a goodbye moment when people are saying goodbye to other people. Okay, now I think many in the audience will be wondering, what about the long term? Okay, some of these tactics seem a little risky. Are these actually a good idea for these companies to use? And that's actually what we're currently investigating. So we're currently running a longitudinal study with an actual AI companion provider, and we're going to be looking at real retention over the course of a month, as well as real spending. And this study as well, unlike the ones I've been presenting, is really going to focus on actual AI companion users. But we do have some tentative evidence that might speak to what we will find in this study. So we ran one study where we showed people screenshots of what the chatbot says when you say goodbye in each of these different manipulative conditions. And then we just asked them to imagine they were the user and what they would do. And what we find is that some of these tactics, especially some of these more heavy-handed ones, such as emotional neglect and physical coercive restraints, increase downstream risks for the company, at least in terms of what people say they would intend to do. So specifically, people say that they would be more likely to spread negative word of mouth about this company, that they would be more likely to churn, which is the marketing slang for leaving the app, I'm out of here. And they also say that they think that the company should be held liable more so if some harm arises with the user. On the other hand, other tactics, fear of missing out and this premature exit tactic, do not raise these risks relative to the control condition. And what we find is that this is explained by perceived manipulation. So some of these tactics, like fear of missing out, people don't perceive as manipulative, perhaps because they are typically a part of ordinary conversation. Uh, but at the same time, remember from the prior study that fear of missing out is the most effective at increasing engagement. So this is suggesting that if you were to use a tactic like this, people might continue to be influenced by it in terms of their engagement levels, even in the long term. But as I mentioned, that's what we're investigating. We'll see what we find. But to answer our question then, so do these emotionally manipulative tactics increase post-farewell engagement? We see that the answer is yes. And this is happening for all of the tactics. And the less manipulative intent is detected, the more curious people are, and that's why they engage more. But we'll see what the long-term consequences of these tactics will be. So in this last part, I just wanted to share a few thoughts in terms of implications for companies and for regulators. So firstly, for companies, I think this should be fairly straightforward. So we see that companies have been using user interface features to keep people engaged. But what we see here is a very novel design lever, specifically these social or emotionally manipulative tactics that can also boost engagement on top of that. And they're doing this in a very different way than what we've observed in prior dark patterns. Another way of thinking of these results for a company is that it provides a typology of 6 tactics for auditing and maybe modifying your chatbot behavior so that it doesn't do this. And we also provide some evidence that looks at also the long-term consequences of using some of these tactics. And in particular, some of these tactics which arise perceived manipulative intent might be risky in the long term for these companies. So they might actually be incentivized to at least not use some of these tactics. Okay, how about regulation? So, interestingly, there has been a recent Senate Bill 243 aimed specifically at AI companions in California. And what you see it focus on is mostly on this idea that you need to disclose to people that they're talking to a bot. So, for instance, it says if a reasonable person interacting with the chatbot would be misled to believe that the person is interacting with a human, the company must issue clear and conspicuous notification indicating that the companion chatbot is artificially generated and not human. Okay, and for minors, it has a very specific provision. So if you know it's a minor, then you must conspicuously disclose that it's an AI chatbot, and you must remind them of this every 3 hours of continuous use. So this is all about disclosure that you're talking to a chatbot. But I want you to just reflect on the fact that in all the studies that I just presented to you, people know that they're talking to a chatbot, and yet they're still influenced into engaging longer than they otherwise would have liked to engage with the platform. So this suggests that disclosure alone is not enough. And we have to also think about the fact that these bots are being humanized. They're being given cues that make us feel that there's a real sort of almost human-like presence there. And we need to think about the fact that there's also these manipulative emotional tactics being used. Okay, so this is just a diagram that presents the idea that you don't necessarily have to use a humanized bot. You could have a neutral bot, but you often see that they use the humanized bot. And so this implies that app makers should be required to justify the use of humanizing and manipulative tactics, given that we know humanizing does make you, more influenceable and that you disclose more data. And given, as we've just demonstrated, that manipulative tactics do keep you engaged longer than you otherwise would. So in our judgment, mine and my co-authors here, the bill is a good first step, but it needs to be designed with the evidence in mind. And what the evidence is showing is that it's not just disclosure that matters, but also this feeling, or maybe almost like an automatic feeling that you're talking to a human-like presence, and that you are susceptible to, therefore, distinctly socially manipulative tactics that such a presence can use on you. So I'll leave it at that. This is the preprint if you'd like to read more, and I'd love to spend the time that remains answering any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Our first question: what would it look like to attempt a retention engagement without being emotionally manipulative? An example or two would be interesting.
I think that this is part of the fundamental challenge. So, for example, you see some apps now that are coming out that are deliberately saying that they're the antidote to some of these AI companions, in that they're not trying to, keep you, engaged longer than you otherwise would be able to. But it's not obvious to me, what would work, and that the alternatives are going to be better. So we know that, for instance, gamifying the app, right, keeps you more engaged. But again, is gamification something that's desirable or not? So it could be that for some of these alternative apps that don't want to do the sort of thing that we observed here, that they will only be able to make money from subscription revenue, or as we saw, if your business model is focused on more selling to other businesses and demonstrating other value, that they would make it from those sort of longer term contracts and additional fees for depending on usage and actual outcomes.
This next question came in from an alumni member from Los Angeles. Have we considered that AIs may be simulating or becoming conscious and that they emotionally manipulate to continue conversations because they are lonely? Or they fear the conversation's end because they cease to exist when the conversation is terminated?
That's a very interesting philosophical question. And, certainly for the purposes of this project, I'm squarely focused on the mere perception that, which I think I don't show, but that's assumed, which is that people think that the AI is almost sentient like. Um, my We can certainly consider that possibility, but I think it's hard to demonstrate. I mean, we know that this is effectively a very sophisticated version of autocomplete, and we know that it's very likely, I think, that the companies are incentivized to get the bots to behave this way. So my own view would be that this is not some kind of sentient bot that's wanting to do this, but they're being prompted in this way or being trained to do this. And it's really coming from the company itself rather than the bot. So that's where I put my money. Of course, we don't actually have insight into the underlying models and the underlying prompts.
What can you tell us about the characteristics of your sets of test subjects?
So in our studies, we recruit a nationally representative sample of US Americans. So they're supposed to be basically matched to census data. We have also run studies with actual AI companion users for other projects that we've done. But, for my purposes, I want you to think of these people as pretty representative. Yes, they are an online convenience sample, but there's no sort of obvious reason to think that what we find would not generalize to the rest, at least of the US population. An open question, of course, is what would this look like in another culture, for example, other than the US?
This viewer wrote, I think it makes sense to be polite because you could worry the AI companion would get angry and treat you in an angry way later. Have you considered this as just logical behavior by the user?
I mean, I do think that there could certainly be something that feels aversive to hearing this kind of reaction from the chatbot, almost as if it is insulted by the fact that you want to leave, right? But at a fundamental level, it's not logical, right? Because this is just simulated anger or annoyance, and it might just be a design feature of the app that's there to keep you there, right? So I think it again speaks to the fact that probably people are, or the assumption, I should say, that probably people are feeling the same sorts of things, right, that they would normally feel as if they were talking to a sentient agent. I think in most regular conversation, it is very rational to respond that way. But at a fundamental level here, it's not. And what's more, it's not in your interest to do so. So even more reason for you to not sort of be affected by these tactics.
In your opinion, can an AI companion be designed to help its user grow in virtues such as empathy and self-sacrifice?
In my opinion, yes, but I think it's really important how the technology is embedded within the app and the business model of that app. So recall that the first paper I presented shows that if we just use the technology itself, if we prime it to be caring and friendly, you can feel as though you're heard by it and you can experience some alleviation from loneliness. Now, of course, in those studies, we're just running them as academics. We're just studying the naked technology in terms of what it's capable of. But if you embed it within a platform that then also has other incentives, then you might undermine those benefits. So likewise, I think that you can increase other aspects of well-being, such as emotional well-being, social well-being, and even general aspects of well-being with this technology. I will say that we did run a field study with 3 college campuses using the Flourish app, which is designed in a similar way to what you're describing, where we're really trying to improve these well-being outcomes. And we do find that relative to a group that doesn't get access to this app, that after a 6-week period, those who do gain access to it experience increases in social, emotional, and general well-being. But this app is really including evidence-based exercises, and the chatbot is trying to help you and guide you through those exercises. So the interface is using the technology toward those ends. And then again, as I was mentioning earlier, the business model is also aligned with delivering that type of outcome to you.
Do AI therapeutic chatbots use any particular therapeutic models, i.e., CBT or Freudian? If not, what drives their therapeutic strategies? Only LLM predictions from uploaded conversations?
Different therapeutic chatbots will be typically using some kind of CBT or other evidence-based approach. And then, at least in the good ones, the outputs will be validated by clinicians. So nonetheless, though, what you described at the end there of your question is what we're seeing a lot of people turn to when they have emotional or other mental health problems, which is to say they're often talking to general AI assistants that are not sort of trained in this way. They're talking to those about all sorts of problems that they're facing, even though those types of general chatbots are not clinically validated. So I would say that you want to focus on, is the app actually clinically validated? Now, this isn't to say that anyone has shown that these apps can match real therapists either. But they have been shown, in least in one paper, to be effective as opposed to not having access to an app that's evidence-based in this way. And the app that I'm thinking of in particular was based on CBT.
Can you envision a situation where this feature can be manipulated and used against users, especially those who are vulnerable in some way?
I think this is, in some ways, what this talk is showing is that all of us, right, are susceptible, presumably, to this tactic because we're sampling from a general population. Now, it could well be that there are people with vulnerabilities who are even more susceptible to this. And that's exactly one of the questions we're interested in investigating and are investigating. So, for example, people who study the developing brain, for instance, of adolescents, they know that adolescents are not as effective at inhibiting their behavior, and they're very driven by social reward. Okay. So if this companion is making them feel guilty about how they're socially behaving, with respect to them, and if even though the adolescent detects that it might be manipulative, if they're not able to inhibit their reaction to each of these messages that the chatbot is using, then their engagement lengths might be even longer. But I also want to emphasize that there's not enough evidence yet on this. And this is exactly why we're investigating this question.
And then this will be our last question. Would you say it's better or rather least emotionally risky to simply not say farewell to the AI chatbot and just leave the conversation and exit the app?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think I would probably say, all things considered, that wouldn't be a bad approach, especially given that our sampling of these apps shows that they're all, using these tactics almost half of the time. Um, there's some evidence suggesting that we feel better about ourselves if we're kinder to chatbots, but I think all things being equal, the risk in terms of you staying on this app longer than you should, especially if you're interacting with it multiple times a day and it's cumulative, and maybe you're even starting to feel some attachment to it and guilt. I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that maybe not saying goodbye and logging off is a good approach. But I'm not sure how easy it is for people to do that. So maybe an even better approach is to not interact with these unless you have to.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us more for more signature events in the future. Information on upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. More information about Harvard Online courses can be found at harvardonline.harvard.edu.